Welcome to AUA Leadership in Business, an official podcast of the American Urological Association.
Welcome to the AUA Leadership in Business podcast, where urologic professionals experience the practical application of business acumen essential to successfully navigate today's rapidly changing business environment. I'm John Lacey, and joining me today to discuss the basics of investing and income streams is Sammy El-Samra and Nick Tadros. This is the third of 3 episodes in this podcast series that focus on personal finance. If you have not listened to the first 2 episodes on behavioral finance for the urologists and insurance considerations, we encourage you to visit the AUA Leadership in Business podcast to check it out, along with this final episode in this series, which we are about to record. So thanks for joining us again. This one is all about investing basics for the urologist, and this is a broad topic. We could probably break up any of these topics into a separate podcast, but we're going to try to cover these topics with sort of a broad overview tonight and hit on some of the key points. As we've said before, personal finance is very personal, so there's not a right or wrong way to do things, but there are some basic principles that can go a long way and kind of steer you in the right direction when you're setting up your retirement accounts and investment accounts. So the first thing I always like to go over, just from a sort of definition standpoint, is having a basic knowledge of the tax code. And so I like to talk about effective tax rate versus marginal tax rate. So the effective tax rate is just the total amount of taxes that you pay relative to your gross income. And this is in contrast to the marginal tax rate, which is the rate at which your next dollar is taxed. So as your income increases and go up into higher tax brackets, that next dollar is taxed at a higher and higher amount. And so a lot of these different tax protected accounts that the government has set up to encourage you to put away money for your retirement are aimed at minimizing your tax burden, especially during your peak earnings years. So Nick, do you want to talk about some of the different pre-tax accounts that are available and how those can be utilized to minimize your tax burden?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of them out there, and people, I think it's really easy to sort of glaze over when you hear about these. They're all named for numbers within the tax code, and so they get very confusing and hard to remember, but they're pretty straightforward, I think. And as you mentioned, John, I think it's really important to keep in mind that at least here we're talking about pre-tax accounts. So these are, accounts that you're going to put money in before you get to your paycheck. You'll be taxed later on when you withdraw it many years from now. But this is a great way to reduce your taxable income so that you pay less tax to Uncle Sam. So I think the ones that everyone have heard about are something like a 401k that's offered almost by any company that you work for. And this is a pre-tax account that is run by your employer and allows you to put in a certain amount of money every year. I believe next year is going up to $20,500 as the max that you can put in per year. And again, this is the one that kind of everyone knows about, everyone hears about and talks about. There are a bunch of others that might be potentially available to you, depending on where you work. In general, academics tend to have more access to more tax accounts, or if you're a nonprofit, because you have the nonprofit side. And so other numbers that you'll hear thrown out as a 401a, that's very similar to a 401k, but has higher limits. And then the other main ones that everyone should be aware of, I think, is a 403b, which is essentially a nonprofit 401k, has similar limits, so $20,500 max that you can put in per year. So then another account that I think a lot of people hear about is the 457, which is another tax advantaged account that has a max of $20,500 you can put into it per year. It's important, though, to know a little bit about this account because there's essentially 2 types, a non-governmental and a governmental tax or a governmental account. And that's really important because this is a unique account that's essentially the money is owned by the company that you're investing with until you take the money out in retirement. So if it's a non-governmental account, this could be provided by essentially a private company, a large hospital system, for example. If that company goes bankrupt, that money can technically be used to pay their creditors in bankruptcy. So you could lose it. If it's a governmental account, the same thing technically applies, but most people think that a state or a city or a country is less likely to go bankrupt, and if they do, they'll have better protections from their creditors. Obviously, that's not 100% true, but something to keep in mind. So if you're for a company, for example, that great track record financially, and you don't know if they're going to be around the long run, and then 57, you might want to think twice about using it, because that money, again, is not yours until you take it out in retirement. So those are kind of the ones. Those are the accounts that are available amongst some others to people who are on W-2 income, or essentially by practice, hospital, a university. If you're a contractor or get 1099 income, you have access to a separate 401k called an individual or solo 401k. And that's another kind of complicated thing, but in that setting, you're the employer and the employee. And so you can actually put more money into that on top of what you put in as a employer, or as an employee. So the $20,500 as the employee, and then you can put more money in as the employer. And if you are both a W-2 income and 1099 income, you actually can have access to both those accounts, and they are separate, including the limits.
Nick, if I'm not mistaken, you could only put in the $20,500 as an employee once into a 401k. So if you're both a W-2 employee, and let's say you do some contracting work on your own, you have 1099 income. To my understanding, I think you could only put in, if you have an individual 401k, you could only put in the employer contribution on that 1099 income. I don't think you're allowed to double
Yes, I
dip.
think correct. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, and I probably misspoke because at least in my job, I don't have a 401k. I have two 401as. So I can actually put in to my solo 401k plus my 401as. But yes, I think you're right. If you have just a 401k through your employer, you won't be able to get the employee contribution on your solo, but you can get the employer contribution, which I believe is up to 20% of the amount, minus payroll taxes, up to 20% of whatever you made as a 1099 income. So if you made $1 million in 1099 income, good for you, first off. And second off, you could put up to $200,000 minus the payroll taxes. So that's a nice way to do it if you're able to.
And I think that's a great summary of things. And as we've already, as you even explained them, there are different availabilities based on your type of job and the type of work that you do, or even your employer. There are some choices there. But the basics of the pre-tax investing, to sort of recap, would be you don't pay tax on those dollars in your peak earnings years when you're making the investment, and then the investment grows tax-free, and then you're taxed on them when you withdraw that money during retirement, which presumably for the vast majority of urologists is going to be less income than during their peak earnings years. If you save a ton of money and you're actually withdrawing more than you did during your peak working years, good for you. That's a golden problem, and there's different strategies for that. But I think for the vast majority of people, the take-home message would be to take advantage of the pre-tax accounts, especially during your peak earnings years. Some employers are going to have a match system, or some private practices are going to be able to do a profit sharing plan and sort of match yourself 2-to-1 and even stash away more money. And there are a lot of different vehicles, but that's kind of the basic concept that I would say. Okay. And this is in contrast, and again, there's all different ones that Nick did a nice job of summarizing. But I like to contrast these with Roth accounts, which are a little different. Another type of tax advantage account, but in this case, you are paying taxes in the year that money was earned, and then you're making the investment. The investment grows tax-free while it is in the Roth account, and then when you withdraw it, you've already paid taxes on it, so you do not pay additional taxes on withdrawal. So this gives you a bit of tax diversification and some different options to go. And you never know; you can't predict the future, but a lot of people think that taxes will generally go up as we age. You can't know that for sure. That can ebb and flow, but it is kind of nice to have some money that is that has already been paid taxes on, and that can be another good vehicle to pass money down to your heirs as well upon death. So that just gives you some flexibility in your retirement years. Y'all have anything to add on that?
Yeah, John, I think one thing to highlight is that we anticipate that we're not going to have a salary when we're in retirement. So there are some people who are going to want to work, and they're going to work into their 70s or 80s or what have you. And so some of the tax benefits or tax protection benefits may not be there as much if you are putting your money into pre-tax accounts. So I think the real benefit comes to the assumption that you're not going to be earning money, in your retirement years. So I think that's an important thing to highlight. So for the residents who are listening out there, you're probably in a low tax bracket. And as a result, it's better for you to put your money into a post-tax account. The money that you earn or that you collect has to go through the tax gate once. So either it goes in before when you invest or after when you take it out. That's the difference between pre-tax and post-tax. And I think when you're in a lower income bracket, putting in your money in a Roth account makes a lot of sense. I also wanted to kind of just piggyback on one of the statements, John, that you mentioned was that your 401ks can be inherited by your heirs. And up until very recently, it was actually dispersed over the actuarial estimated life expectancy of the heir. But I think in 2020, when was it the Secure Act, or I forget the exact name of the act, when that came out, they limited it to 10 years. And so that increases your tax liability now, because if you have an inheritance 401k of like $1 million, now you're paying that out over 10 years. That could actually almost be a tax liability for the heir. So that's something to keep an eye on and to think about, maybe for your folks now, and then for your kids in the future.
That's a great point. Great point. Hopping back to the Roth accounts, we mentioned we mentioned the limitations on how much you could stash away from a pre-tax standpoint. There are limitations on the Roth accounts as well as income limits on which. So I think most practicing urologists will not be eligible to make direct Roth contributions, depending on your plan. I guess there are some retirement plans at different jobs that could have this as an option, but for most just W-2 employees, that would be difficult. But there is such a thing as a backdoor Roth, and again, that could be a separate podcast, or you can Google that, and there's several good articles out there, step-by-step articles on that. But basically, you make a Roth contribution into a standard Roth IRA, and then you're able to, or a standard IRA, and you're able to transfer that into a Roth account up to $6,000 a year this year, and then $6,500 next year. So not huge numbers, but these are little things that can add up. Again, give you tax advantages and give you some flexibility down the road.
And if I could just add one thing to, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, there's also the term Roth. We usually use it, I think, when we're talking about high income earners, which hopefully our listeners are, in the terms of the Roth IRA, as John was talking about. But technically, almost any account can be a quote Roth account. So some plans will provide, you can have like a Roth 401k, for example, which, as Sammy was alluding to, might be a better investment for a resident who are not in their peak earning years and are paying a lot of taxes. I think usually for people who are in their peak earning years, essentially attending urologists, a Roth 401k is probably not beneficial compared to a 401k. But some people, like John said, really like that idea of having money grow tax-free. And that does give you some flexibility as you get older and in retirement. But I think it's important to know that there can be a bunch of different kinds of Roth accounts. So I think the Roth IRA is sort of the most famous or the most talked about account.
Yeah, and I think hopefully the audience is savvy enough to know that you can save more than what your qualified retirement accounts allow. Even if you have a 401a and a 403b and a 457, that's $60,000, and that's great to save. But again, you should be saving 15-20% of your gross income towards your retirement. And so I think it behooves all of us to probably save more than that $60,000 a year.
I think that's a great plug for our first podcast where we talked about the importance of saving lots of money.
Yeah. And so I think to that end, everybody should probably be contributing to a backdoor Roth IRA. So that's an additional $6,000 post-tax that, you could then, there's investment changes or differences in the investment that you could do based on pre-tax, post-tax accounts. So.
And that's a great point, Sammy, and I agree, Nick. That's what we touched on in our first podcast about behavioral finance. You need to have a written plan. You need to have a goal for what you need for retirement, and you need to have a plan to get there. And whether that's something that you can turn this into a hobby and educate yourself and do on your own, or choose a financial advisor to help you out with this, you need to know how much you need to be storing away each year and have a plan to do so. And yeah, we're talking about, we're focused on the tax advantage accounts, but Sammy's absolutely right. A brokerage account or a taxable account almost sounds like a 4-letter word, but if you choose tax efficient investments, these can be great vehicles as well, and they'll get you to the number that you need to be investing on an annual basis to reach your financial goals.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too. And I guess this is a great segue into the post-tax accounts. But I think the vast majority of practicing urologists and high-income professionals don't have access to enough pre-tax account space to save up enough for retirement, as Sammy said. So honestly, the majority of a lot of people's wealth in retirement is going to be in a post-tax account, a brokerage account, or something similar. And so I think people need to remember that it's not that you just max out my 401k, I'm going to be fine. You need to be putting away a lot more money than that. And once you max that out, you got to get into the post-tax accounts, which I think will, John, I don't know if you want to talk about it.
Well, before we hop into post-tax, just one last pre-tax account I think that's important to highlight is the HSA, so the health savings account. So if your employer offers a high deductible health plan, then basically there's, it's this health insurance that you sign up for where you're responsible for like the first $10,000. And then after that, the insurance really kicks in. Part of that plan includes an HSA or health savings account, which is basically like a mini 401k. And what's really nice is, as you hear on these podcasts that we all listen to, it's triple tax free. So it goes in pre-tax and it grows without tax, and it comes out without tax applied if you use it for health-related expenditures. And that could be anything. And I'm certain all of us are going to have health-related expenditures as we get into our retirement years. So I think that's an important caveat. If you got little kids that are running around and they're always ending up in the ER like my kids, maybe not a great plan for you. But if you're a single person, or you got no kids, or you and your wife or your spouse or your partner are happy and healthy and don't have much medical needs, then you could save, I believe it's $3,000 each pre-tax. I don't know if it's gone up recently, but I think that's a viable plan.
It's $3,650 per person this year, and it goes up to a total of $7,750 for a couple next year. So it's good. It's not, and then once again, another way to lower your tax burden in the year you're earning that money. And as you said, Sammy, it grows tax free. And then what we do, I do have a high deductible healthcare plan and a HSA. So we actually cash flow our doctor's visits and everything and save receipts. And then we can continue to let the HSA money, grow over the years, and we can hold on those receipts. And then when we do withdraw money down the road, we can withdraw that a tax-free basis. So that's how we're using it, and I'm pretty happy with it.
Yeah, I think my kids end up in the ER way too often, and so it is not a viable option for me. So.
You're hitting your deductible, huh?
Yeah. I think one thing that bears repeating too, because it can be confusing. This is only available with a high deductible insurance plan. So, like, I don't have the option where I work to even have a high deductible plan. So you just have to bear that in mind when you're picking. And like Sammy said. Even though you might lose access to the HSA because you have sort of a regular deductible plan, that might be what's best for your family.
Right.
And then I think the other, so I get that question a lot too, where residents or coworkers are like, hey, how do I open this HSA? And I'm like, buddy, you can't. You got Blue Cross, Blue Shield, or whatever for your insurance. And I think the other thing to remember is it is different than the FSA, which is another health savings account that does not have those triple tax benefits. And it's something, essentially, it's a pre-tax account that you lose. I believe you lose every year if you don't use it in the year that you put the money into. And that's available to pretty much everyone. I think most people, yes, you'll save a few $100 or a few, probably $50 or $60 on the hundreds of dollars that you put into that to pay for your tax or pay for your healthcare in that plan year. But I know for me, that's just a little too confusing to have to deal with. But yeah, don't get confused between the HSA and the FSA.
And you can't have both, if I'm not mistaken. You cannot have both an FSA and an HSA at the same time.
Yep.
So, and yet one more tax advantage account. This is a post-tax account, but tax advantage for those of you with kids or planning to potentially have kids, is a 529 account. These vary state by state, but basically you put post-tax dollars into an account. The growth is protected, so you don't pay taxes on the growth, and the dollars upon withdrawal are not taxed if they're used for qualified educational purposes. So these are kind of cool. They're transferable as well, so that there's a myriad of outlooks on how much to put into these. There are some people that want to cover part of their college education or beyond for their kids. There are some people that just sock as much money as they can in there, and they think that the benefits from the compounded growth there will outweigh any sort of tax drag if they use it for non-educational purposes, or they'll pass it down to grandkids or nieces or nephews or someone else. But from talking to people, there are all different kind of outlooks on that. I use them. I'm kind of in the middle. I've got 3 kids. I'm putting away money for each of them to pay for part of college, but I'm also planning to sort of cash flow the rest of the college education. I'm not kind of overfunding my 529s, but again, there are a lot of opinions on what the best way to proceed with that is.
Well, I think the important point, John, here is that there are many options to fund education for your kids down the road. There are no options to fund your retirement, or very few options to fund your retirement down the road. So I think you really got to take care of your retirement first. And if you have extra, sure, put in the 529. I do have 529 for my kids. I use it. It's part of my investment plan. But again, it's a small part because I got to be able to make sure that I could eat and have shelter when I'm in my 70s and 80s. My kids, when they're in college, there's options. They could take out loans. I could bankroll their college. They could go to community college. Right? There's all sorts of options there. They could get scholarships or grants or go to the military and get paid back. So I think there's lots of options there. But for retirement, not so much.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Sammy. I think, you could borrow for education. You can't borrow for retirement. And as someone who does help my parents out financially because of some financial struggles they had a while back, I know everyone, including my parents, right, kicked themselves about, and they paid for my college, thank God, which was amazing. But I'm sure if they had saved that money instead of paying for my overpriced liberal arts education, they might not be in a similar situation. And so I know, especially as I think physicians and parents, for many of us, we want to put we're used to self-sacrifice and putting our kids first, which I think is the right thing to do, obviously. But in this scenario, I think it is something that you do have to weigh the pros and cons, because you might think you're putting your kids first by sending them, paying for their college, but when you're asking them for money because you can't afford your health insurance or your house or your groceries, you might think differently.
Excellent voice. We should help from a position of strength, right? So it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think. Oh, I don't know if you're going to move on, John, but I think another cool thing about the 529s is they're run by the states, and so every state has a slightly different take on the 529, including how much is tax deductible. And for those of you who know, like Morningstar, which is a company out there that does reviews of stocks and stuff, they have this great rating system for reviewing how good a state's 529 plan is. And so what's cool is if you do plan on sort of putting a lot of money into this for your kids, if you're in a state with a crappy 529, you can just fund that 529 up to the level maybe where you get the state tax deduction, and then you're actually free to put your money into other states' 529s if they have better investment options, or maybe the cost of the plan isn't as much. So there's a lot that you can do with the 529 in terms of not just sticking with your state. And I know, Sammy and John, I'd just be interested to know what your thoughts are, and you kind of alluded to it, but for my personal education, on sort of overfunding a single 529 if you have multiple kids versus having one for each kid. So I know right now I have 2 kids, but I have one 529, and I'm debating whether or not I should open up one for my second kid, because again, I don't want to. I'd love to have money in the account to pass down to my grandkids to pay for their college and great grandkids and whatever. But I also don't want to be sitting, if my kid gets a scholarship to college and I have $500,000 in this 529 or 2 529s, I feel like I might limit my, I guess, loss, for lack of a better term, with just having one that I could potentially pay for 2 kids out of. And I know I lose the tax benefit of having 2, but just want to get your maybe thoughts on that.
No, and what's more is, you don't have to be the parent to open up a 529. So you could be a grandparent. And that also, some people say that may shelter some of the universities from knowing what do you have in your accounts for the kids, so that they could, right size their scholarships or their grants. So I'm in favor of having less accounts and less amounts of 529s because you can transfer it from sibling to sibling. You could even transfer it to nieces and nephews. I'm hopeful that I could be magnanimous, and God willing, my kids get full ride scholarships to great universities, and I could just give it to my nieces and nephews. Maybe they'll have full ride scholarships, and I'll be asking my siblings for their 529s.
Or your great grandkids.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I have one for each of my kids, and I kind of fund it. Yeah, I fund them differently because they have different growth horizons. They're each 2 or 3 years apart. But yeah, I didn't get too fancy. I have the kind of the similar investments, and I have them. I've thought about that, but I did not. Again, it's a great question. It's a great point. I think there's pros and cons to either one of those.
I think it's a perfect point to mention that this stuff could be a full-time job, and I think it's important to just have a set plan almost and just make things automatic, contributions automatic. Maybe once a year, look at your investments and how you're invested in stocks or bonds or what have you. And then you readjust, and then you let it go. And then if you're not comfortable doing that, I think this is the right place for having a good financial advisor.
So we've spent a good portion of the episode talking about all these different accounts and their pros and cons and everything. But what I'd like to sort of transition to is, what do you buy within those accounts, right? So it's great to have the tax advantages, but if you have crappy investments within these tax advantage accounts, it could all go to naught. So, Nick, do you want to talk about the difference between an active and a passive fund? I think that's where you kind of start, and then we talk about different funds to pick and how to choose them. And I bet we'll all have different takes on how we invest.
Yeah, so I think it can get confusing, but honestly, I think if you think of it in kind of bigger, broader categories, it's not that complicated, I think. So when we're talking about, usually when we're talking about retirement and investing, we're talking about investing in stocks, right? Which are just owning a part of a publicly traded company. So you can do that individually, right? You can buy 10,000 stocks of Amazon or 5 stocks of Starbucks or whatever, and you can invest that way. I think I think the three of us are in agreement here. The easiest way, and I think the best way to invest, is to invest in a group or a bucket of stocks, which can vary. And because there's just as many companies as there are that have offerings, you can get any bucket you want. You can have a bucket of just technology stocks. You have a bucket of, natural gas stocks. You have a bucket of stocks that have a proven track record in social and environmentalism. And so there's these buckets. And then in these buckets, they can either be actively managed or passively managed. So a passively managed fund would be a bucket of stocks that just follows usually some sort of standard. So, for example, there's some famous ones like that we all know about, right? The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500, the Standard & Poor 500. We've all heard of these, and that's essentially just a group of funds. Dow Jones, I think, is 20 stocks. S&P 500 is 500 stocks, and that's a bucket. And a passive index fund, for example, will follow that index. So if you get an S&P 500 index fund, that's just going to follow the S&P 500, and by every dollar you put in is going to be split the same way between those 500 companies that the S&P splits it. And that's a passive fund. Those are really cheap. They're, I think, great investment vehicles because they're hands-off, they're easy, and then, obviously, if you look historically, they tend to continue to raise. An actively managed fund is going to cost you more money, either upfront, preloaded, or on the back end, because part of what you're giving it when you put that money in is you're paying someone or a company to actively be a stock picker for you and actually pick the stocks that they think are going to do well, either based on their algorithms or research or a flip of a coin or whatever they use. And so those active funds usually cost more. And then, of course, this is a big debate that could be a whole another section. I'm sure John and Sammy have feelings on this. The people that are trying to sell you these, the financial advisors, are going to tell you that their actively managed stocks are going to get you more return. I think historically, and if you look at the data, that's not true. But even if it is, you also have to consider the cost that you're paying that advisor or that company that's going to come directly off the top of the stocks. So if you are in two funds that are similar, actively managed, let's say you get 9% back in profit, and passively you get 8%. So you're like, oh, well, I'm going to go for the active fund. But then once you find out that you're paying 1.5% to that stockbroker to pick those stocks, you're actually only getting 7.5% in that active fund versus the passive fund. So I know that's probably a little more than what you wanted, John. Let's get into my opinions of it too. But that's sort of the generics. Is you can invest in stocks, and we'll get to bonds and stuff later. But you can invest in individual stocks. You can invest in groups of stocks, and those groups of stocks can either be passively managed by just following an index, or they can be actively managed by someone, by the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain.
Yeah, I agree. I think, there are a lot of data about active versus passive management, and a vast majority of the time, the passive funds do better. Not to mention the different fee structures, as Nick nicely laid out there. That's where I was gonna go next. Was you want to build a portfolio with a mix of stocks and bonds, right? And then this is where you can get. Everyone's got different opinions on what percentage. In general, the younger you are, the longer time horizon you have between you and retirement. You have time to take more risk, and in general, stocks are a higher risk yet higher reward type investment. Whereas in general, bonds are lower risk, lower reward vehicle. And so as you go on through your career and get closer to retirement, you're going to shift from a higher stock to bond ratio, and that's going to start to even out closer towards retirement. Within the stocks, then you get to decide, as Nick said, there's lots of different buckets. There are domestic stocks, there are international stocks, and then there are all the different factors that you can use. You talked about technology and all these different types of things. one of the famous types of portfolios that's been popularized by the Bogleheads or the Vanguard folks that sort of came up with the idea of these index funds that they call them, these buckets that track a particular index, would be a 3-fund portfolio, which has a certain percentage of domestic stocks, international stocks, and bonds, and it keeps it very simple. It gives you diversification across the entire U.S. market, the entire world, and the entire bond markets. And you can, in your investment plan, you can sort of decide what your ratios of those funds are and what they should be. And as Sammy was saying earlier, then at a certain interval, whether that's once a year, once a quarter, twice a year, whatever it is, you check in and you rebalance and readjust as needed. That's not reacting to the market and say, oh gosh, well, international stocks are down, so let's sell those. You're sort of chasing returns, and actually that tricks you into selling low and buying high. When you're doing that, it keeps you, and it also keeps you away if you're not constantly, if you're watching TV shows and looking at your phone and watching stocks go up and down constantly. There is good data to show that you are going to be more active, and you're going to make more sales and purchases. You're going to incur more fees and probably have lower performance the more actively you're tracking these things. So get a plan, stick with it. There's a million different ways to go, but those are my kind of basic takes on things.
I think, and John, I think another that kind of leads into some, we were talking about kind of this plan and stuff, and I think it is really important to have some sort of written investment plan. People call it different things. I call it an investor policy statement. I think we all have something similar, but that really helps you stay the course, because you write down your goals, you write down your plan that how you're going to get to those goals. And again, you're writing this not at a time of crisis when the stock market's crashing or whatever. And so you're that you're going to stick with that plan. And I know my policy statement is several pages. It includes my insurance plans, my 529 plans, my asset allocation, everything. And so I think staying the course, which you hear a lot of people say, is really important, is that you pick what you feel is a comfortable asset allocation, that you won't feel the need to be checking your stocks every single day to sell and buy because you're worried about it, that you feel that you can stick with sort of through thick and thin, and you'll probably be okay. And then, like Sammy said, only checking it every once in a while. It's funny, actually, before we started this podcast, we were talking about our own individual strategies, which we can probably talk about if we want. But I actually had to pull up my IPS statement to double check, because I don't, it's all on autopilot. And I do, I check it like once a year. So it's not something that I'm changing all the time. And so I actually, at first I was ashamed to, get ready to do this podcast, and I had to look at my own asset allocation. But then I was like, that's actually a good sign. It's that I'm not actively changing things all the time. It's sort of set, it's autopilot, and that's kind of the way it is.
Absolutely. We're not day trading here. I think we're decade trading. And so you need to be really slow and deliberate with your moves. There's always going to be the little ups and downs. Don't let that bug you. I think, it steady goes, and that's what we're doing.
I will say, I sort of know back here, we talked a lot earlier about the different pre-tax accounts. You don't necessarily have control over what investments are in that account, right? Your institution, your employer puts together those plans, and there are certain options. So they might not have the exact fund that you want. And so that's what I've done in my retirement accounts. You take the best available, and there's almost always, there should be, for goodness sake, there should be something like the S&P 500 or the Vanguard total market index fund, something like that, something very bland, low fees, low cost, that gives you great diversification. And so I know with my personal portfolio, I start in that with my 401k and profit sharing plan, take the best available there. And then I've started to use other funds. And certainly now that I'm funding a brokerage account on top of all the tax advantage accounts, that's a place where I can catch up if I wanted to. Like I have a fair amount of exposure to international index funds, and I can catch up in that taxable brokerage account. While still not sacrificing, I don't have to follow the investor policy statement to I don't have to have it. Every different account doesn't need to have 3 different funds in it. You sort of look at the whole asset allocation and pick the best available where you can.
And I think that's important. Yeah, to remember is that you're looking at your overall asset allocation. So like in one of my pretty big accounts, it just has 100%. I wanted the total stock market index fund, but it's an S&P 500 index fund, and 100% of the money that goes into that account is that. So looking on the outside, someone might say, or that one's through Morgan Stanley or something, through one of the ones that I have with my university. You can look at that from the outside and go, oh, you're 100% invested in the U.S. stock market, which honestly actually is probably not the worst of investment choices, but the point remains that it's not. That's yes, in that account I am, but overall I'm better diversified. So keep that in mind that when you're doing your asset allocation, you really want to look at all the accounts you have, not just individual in each individual account. And I think, go ahead, Sammy.
And I was going to say, be savvy about what's your tax accounts and what's your non-tax accounts. So, for instance, if part of your financial plan includes bonds and you want to do municipal bonds are tax-free, you probably should put that in your brokerage non-tax saved account, your non-employee account, whereas put your higher tax liability allocations within your Roth or within your 401k.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example, and that's getting definitely into like what I think is super exciting about investing. But I think some people might glaze over when they're thinking about tax loss harvesting and what which are more tax efficient funds. And I think for those people, an option too is the target date funds. And John might want to share his thoughts on this, but essentially a target date fund is a fund that automatically changes based on your age. So you pick by your age or your retirement date, and essentially early on in that fund's life, it's going to invest more essentially in the stock market. And as the fund matures, it's going to invest more in bonds or in safer investments that aren't as volatile, so that when it's time for you to take your money out, you're not going up and down a lot. And that's an easy way where you could essentially get a 3-fund portfolio that John was alluding to, or something like that, in a single fund. And so you might have that available to you in your through your company or whatever. They do tend to cost a little bit more. The basis points are higher. But again, if you don't have the bandwidth to sort of do the nitty gritty, that's an option too.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, the target date funds can be good, and I do own some of those. As Nick pointed out, they have a little bit higher fees because they're doing the rebalancing for you, and so they are doing a little work behind the scenes. You can literally set it and forget it, where you can have that money going in there and never think about your asset allocation at all if it's in there. And you can just set it for the longest. You don't have to pick the actual day you're going to retire. You can set it for whatever, 2065 right now, I think, or something like that. So you can put the longest time horizon to keep things as aggressive as stock heavy as you want, as you're early in your career, as I am. The one criticism I've heard, I was just looking at this earlier, was it is a little heavier on international than some people are willing to be. I've heard some of those, and the Vanguard can be somewhere up in the 35 to 40% international, which some people are not as comfortable with. I have international exposure, but that's a little higher than mine. I think in my my 529s, I think I have 30% international, and for the rest of our portfolio, it's about 20%. And so that'd be the one thing. Plus, to your point, if it's not all in just that one target date fund, then you're going to have to go back to your other accounts, and you're still going to have to rebalance and look at your overall asset allocation.
Yeah, and since we're talking about that, if you guys don't mind sharing what your guys' asset allocation is overall, so if anyone is interested, again, there's not a right or wrong answer, but I'm sort of like John. I'm a little heavier in U.S. stocks and international stocks. I've actually thought about changing that. It's been a thought process for the last probably year or so. Again, just like Sammy said, don't make any sudden changes. But right now, I'm at 70% U.S. stocks, 15% international stocks, 10% U.S. bonds and fixed income investments, and then 5% real estate syndications. And I know personally, I think everyone does a little bit differently. We're not really going to have time to talk about real estate and stuff, but I've thought about increasing my real estate exposure through REITs, real estate syndications, and increasing my international stock exposure a little bit. But I don't know what you guys think about, or what your kind of asset allocation is.
So mine is, again, this is the first year I've more aggressively funded my brokerage account. So I'm heavier in the U.S. stocks than my policy statement would lead me to believe. I'm catching up on that pretty quickly as I add more international. But my goal is to get 70% in U.S. stocks, 20% in the international stocks, which I'm almost to that goal, and then 10% in real estate. And you'll notice when you add those up, I don't have any bonds in there, Nick, which may make you nervous. I am more aggressively paying my mortgage down as well, and I'm kind of treating that as a bond. My wife has some.
And that's pretty common, I think, right? I mean, if you want to expand on that a little bit, we probably don't have time, but a lot of people will treat that as like a negative bond and pay that as a way of sort of quote investing in bonds.
Yeah, and as far as like you said, a negative bond, and and the concept of exactly what what you're going to earn off that, right? So I refinanced my house as the interest rates went down. I've got it down at 3.15%. So as I pay that off more aggressively, I know my return is going to be right there. Is 3.15%. And so there could be some years where bonds do better than that. And there could be some years where bonds do better than that. But that's what I'm doing at this stage. I'm sure, again, as I get closer to retirement, I'll obviously change that up a little bit and have less risky investments. But at this point, just my 7th year out, I feel pretty comfortable without that. Not for everybody, but I feel comfortable doing that in my statement.
I'm very heavily tilted towards stocks as well. 70% U.S., probably 30% international, and then probably overall I have 5% REITs and 5% bonds. And I've let it go. I haven't looked at. I'm due to rebalance, so I'm gonna see what it looks like now. I'm sure I'm gonna have to buy a lot more stocks, I think.
So I think that's cool. It's interesting. I mean, we're all pretty similar. I mean, well, for the most part, I'm impressed. We all have exactly, we're aiming for 70% U.S. stocks. Maybe that's the magic number. I don't. No, thanks for sharing, guys. I think that's cool to hear. And I know for the people listening, there's definitely no right or wrong asset allocation. I think we all think that what we're doing is right. But I think as long as you stick with you pick an asset allocation that you can be comfortable with, and through thick and thin, when the market's doing well and the market's doing bad, and you feel that it's a reasonable asset allocation to get you to your goals, and whatever your goal is in retirement in terms of that magic number that we kind of talked about in our first episode, then you're probably doing it right. And I think we'll say this over and over again, but the key is just to keep investing and putting the money into that. Your savings rate will overcome a multitude of sins if you realize that maybe you shouldn't have put that extra money into crypto, or maybe 70% U.S. stocks is the wrong answer or whatever. But luckily, as physicians, we're high income earners, and we can overcome maybe some mishaps with asset allocation just by the brute force of saving extra money.
Well, I think we're getting a little short on time, so I think we'll probably try to wrap this episode up. But I appreciate everybody joining us, and Nick and Sammy. It's been a joy recording these episodes with you. I'd like to close by saying I hope tonight didn't sound too complicated. You can get dragged down by all the numbers and letters and the different machines and vehicles, but my takeaway from this is we're three guys, we've kind of talked offline, that have all sort of gotten interested in personal finance over the last few years. We've been exposed to like the White Coat Investor. We've read some of the same books, and we read blogs. We've gotten into it, and it's really not as complicated as it seems at first glance. So if you catch that fire and want to turn it into more of a hobby. There's no one out there in the world that's going to care more about your money than you are. And I think I try to teach my residents, you should at least know, maybe not everyone's going to manage their own finances, but you should at least know where your money's going and kind of know some of the basics, so you don't get taken advantage of or get in a bad financial spot. But hopefully this will light the fire for some people. And for others, hopefully it'll just get you interested in asking the right questions and making a plan, because I really do feel like money is a taboo subject at times, but if you are financially savvy and you're financially secure, I think it can really translate into happiness inside and outside the hospital, make you a better doctor, and make you less concerned about your financial well-being.
And I'll just echo what John said. I totally agree. I think it does seem complicated at first with the numbers and letters and stuff, but really after you read a book or two, spend a little bit of time learning about the stuff, blogs, books, whatever, even working with a financial advisor that's willing to teach you and willing to be, fired at some point. I think it's very manageable. I enjoy it. I think all three of us enjoy doing it ourselves. But I really think you can do a ton on your own, and I think it's not near as hard as you think it is.
Yeah, I think we all will be familiar with the phrase, you can't win the game if you don't know the rules. So learn the rules. And, I think it's not that complex. It's actually rewarding to know where your money is going. And John and Nick, it's been a pleasure chatting with you guys. I've learned a lot from you guys. And maybe there's a Bogglehead episode coming up from this discussion. I think there's enough interest there. So.
Yeah, reach out to us. Thanks for listening, and reach out to us via social media or give us some feedback and let us know. We're happy to create more content in the future with whatever you're interested in.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make AUA Leadership in Business your go-to podcast. Subscribe today by searching AUA Leadership in Business on your favorite podcast app and enhance your leadership and business education needs.